and I like to say I'm a psychologist by training and a UX writer by trade, and both of these fields kind of affect each other.
That is Kalina Tyrkiel, a user experience writer over in Poland. I'm Josh Burke, your host for the Salesforce Developer Podcast, and here on the podcast, you'll hear stories and insights from developers for developers. However, today we actually go down a slightly different route. Kalina is not in our Salesforce developer community. However, she does use her background in psychology to author content about neurodiversity and how it impacts user experience design. So sit down with me and Kalina where we talk about some of the ins and outs to think about when it comes to accessibility and building out your interfaces for the neurodivergent. However, we start with her early years and specifically talking about chatbots.
Yeah, so my thesis was, it was about chatbots, and my chatbots was like, the chatbots I used for the thesis were pretty simple. They were all like no code made by myself. So obviously I work with developers in my day-to-day work, but these were all like self-made. And the factors were like, for example, the tone the chatbots use, the kind of, like the time, the intervals when it comes to answers, like whether the things that we think that will make the chatbots more human would influence the satisfaction. And what turned out to be is that actually people don't like it when the chatbots are like too human, when they kind of fall into this uncanny valley, let's say.
Really?
And yeah. I mean, this effect wasn't like very, very strong, but there was something to it, like when the chatbots, they are like overly enthusiastic, people get to, like, they tend to be a little bit suspicious and kind of even like, like kind of, they feel weird, like they feel like something's off. So, yeah.
Really? So it's kind of like a reverse Turing test. Like if people can kind of tell that maybe the chatbot's trying to game them a little bit, it freaks them out.
Yeah, you could say that definitely. Like I was thinking a lot about the Turing test and about like this experiment. Like I think Uncanny Valley is like what really crossed my mind multiple times when writing it. Like kind of the Uncanny Valley effect, but more on the, on a conversational level. Yeah. So that was like interesting and something like worth looking into more.
Nice. That's fascinating. So, okay. So our main topic today is something that I'm going to confess is actually, it's very personal to me. I have a lot of friends and family who are on the spectrum. And then if we take that definition to the broader category of neurodiversity, there's even a lot more people. So you've written a lot of neurodiversity and how it impacts user experience, or I suppose technically the other way around. First, how would you define neurodiversity?
So like to start with, I really like the idea of neurodiversity, the fact that it's like focuses on your strengths, about like what makes you different, what can make you, just different without kind of categorizing it as good or bad, because I'm not really a fan of, of this like pathogenetic approach about like, defining what makes something a pathology or a deficit. And sometimes, like what makes you neurodiverse can even be considered as an advantage. I think like one of the most popular example is, Greta Thunberg. Like she's diagnosed with Asperger's, and she even she went as far as calling it a superpower when under the right circumstances. So this is like a whole new view. And like even the term neurodiversity, it's pretty fresh. I think it was coined like somewhere in the 1990s. So it's like, it's only been a few decades. And there are like people like neurodiversity advocates, such as Tim Goldstein. He's experience in tech. He's a person who's a neurodiversity advocate, a communication specialist. And he kind of felt that something about him was kind of different, and he only found out he was diagnosed as neurodiverse, as someone on the spectrum, when he was 54. So that was like super late. And what is very important about neurodiversity is that you can, like say that only like 1% people are autistic, if you may, but it is estimated, and it's still like believed to be quite a conservative estimate, that actually around 15% of the population, of the global population, is somewhere on the neurodiversity spectrum. And it's not only in autism, it's not just autism spectrum, and there is more to that. There is dyslexia, which is believed to be like, I know the numbers for Poland, which is my like home country. It's believed to be like 10%. So it kind of translates to like 4 million roughly, which is quite a lot.
Yeah.
And there is also attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is ADHD, and other kinds of being like neurodiverse that are not always equal to autism, and they can like manifest in many different ways.
Yeah. Well, and so I think that's an important part of it. Like, well, how broad of a category is this? What falls under neurodiversity?
Yeah, so there's like, it can apply to many different, as I said, like many different categories, many different, like, it can manifest in many ways. Like it can apply to perception, to how we like perceive the world. It can apply to memory. Like people who are neurodiverse, they can like be very, very good at remembering certain things and not so good when it comes to others. It also applies to how they process language. For instance, it's like one of the most common examples that people on the autism spectrum, they have like quite a hard time with metaphors. Metaphors can that can be problematic, and they don't kind of understand the meaning behind them. And it also applies to obviously to attention, which is quite prevalent in ADHD. And all sorts of cognitive functions, to be honest. And it can, like, when you have like one autistic person, it can display it can show in a very different way than when you compare it to another autistic person. So that's very, very personal.
Got it. Well, I think it's interesting. This overlaps an episode I did with Adam Ronenbach, who's an accessibility specialist here at Salesforce. And, he was the first one who's like, accessibility includes these things, and including, people with, that have fallen in this category, because this isn't necessarily a special situation, right? Like this all falls under accessibility, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I believe like many of these accessibility guidelines, accessibility standards, like the standards described by WCAG and all these institutions that do like tremendous job when it comes to, spreading awareness and like creating the standards for accessibility. A lot of these things are kind of universal. Like a lot of these accessibility guidelines apply to neurodiverse users as well. But there are some things obviously that are quite specific when it comes to the neurodiverse user group. Gotcha.
Okay, so let's talk about a few of those specifics. You write about a series of categories to focus on. Let's go down some of that. First is typography. What are some pitfalls that people can fall in there?
Yeah, so when it comes to typography, like one of the most important things to keep in mind is to keep the font sans serif, which is especially the body text. And this is quite a common choice when it comes to web design nowadays. Like it's considered standard when it comes to creating websites currently. But it's also worth remembering that we need to keep a sufficient distance between the letters. And the kerning should be they shouldn't be too close to each other. And so when it comes to like specific numbers, I think it's just good to remember the number 3.5 and 35, because 35% kerning is like the ideal letter width. And the interword spacing, the space between the words, should be at least like 3.5 times bigger than the width. So these are just like some of the basic rules to remember. Anyway, we just need to keep in mind not to keep the letters too close to each other, basically. And when it comes to the sizes, it's also about the font size, which also applies to people with vision impairment, to people like myself, for example. I think if you work in tech, if you spend a fair share of your life in front of the computer, you might have a vision impairment. Right. So this is quite common. And it's also suggested that, the font size should be between 12 and 13 points. So this is considered standard. So this is also something to keep in mind. And when it comes to typefaces itself, it's actually quite, I like this fun fact a lot, so I'm going to mention it as well. Although Comic Sans might not be the aesthetic, goal we might aim for, it's actually quite dyslexia friendly, and people with dyslexia will actually like it a lot. Really? It will make their life easier. So, and I checked with some of my, it's just, not like statistically significant evidence, but I asked my dyslexic friends and they agreed. So there's something to it.
Nice. Okay. So I have a lot of designer friends, so I can't be on the mic recommending Comic Sans necessarily, but that's hilarious but also very interesting. So what specifically like is Comic Sans something that people can kind of learn from because it's a sort of a high watermark?
Yeah, I think it's like I think it was like kind of designed for learning. Like it's very very easy to read, even if it's like resized. And there is something to it when it comes to differentiating the letters. Like it's very easy to tell apart D and B or P and Q. And it's very it's very obvious. And when you have like serif fonts, then it kind of especially when in on the screens, it can get a bit harder. So this is what makes sans serif typefaces a much better choice when it comes to designing for the neurodiverse user groups.
Got it. Nice. Okay, so how the words appear is important, but also talking about the words themselves. You write that plain language is one of the greatest allies of neurodiversity. What do you mean by that?
I believe plain language is one of the greatest allies of good design in general, and I believe it's also in terms of neurodiversity, it's crucial because it decreases the tension. And it also like decreases the cognitive overload. Plain language makes the information easy to access. I think it's also like, about decreasing the amount of things on a website in general. It's about removing everything that's unnecessary and just showing the crucial information. Because when you read interviews with neurodiverse users, when you hear them speaking about their experience, they say what is most frustrating is like going through websites that just have too much of everything. It's like trying to find out the main points. And one thing that really seemed surprising to me was an interview with an autistic user I've once read, and she said that she really dislikes Twitter because Twitter is like just packed with words, and the whole architecture is just so overwhelming that she can't really get through it without frustration.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent example because I even find Twitter overwhelming from time to time. So and it is. I think it's been, it's called the fire hose of information and not by accident. You were mentioning earlier, like metaphors and how that can be tricky. Like what are some specifics there? What are some pitfalls?
Yeah, so I think it's also like important when it comes to writing for people who are not native English speakers. Like myself, like I think my level of English is like good enough to understand some of the most common metaphors, but still, like when you have people, like when you write for like a big social media platform, let's say, not all of them are going to be able to understand something that's like perfectly obvious for a native speaker, and same applies to neurodiverse users. Like when you call it a day, they might kind of understand you're actually like calling it a day. Literally. And
like literally like that thing's a day.
Yeah, exactly. And like it's not like it doesn't make them like less intelligent. It's just like they kind of process it in a different way. And when you have like just like very, very important, like crucial parts of the user journey, it's much safer and much more accessible to just say that something is done. Got
it. So let's talk a little bit about specific kinds of text. Like for instance, you write about the differences between good user-friendly button text and bad user-friendly button text. Like, what are some distinctions there?
Yeah, so as a designer, as a developer, you might be tempted to write something like "click here," just like a general button text, and it might seem like just very direct, like it just says "click here," so the user knows exactly what they are supposed to do. And it's not always like that. And I think one of the best examples is when you look at it as the user of a screen, from the perspective of a screen reader. Like this, when you have a screen reader, sometimes it just kind of grabs all the links from a website and creates a list of them. And then you have a list of all click here's, like several click here's in a row. So you kind of like lose track of what's in there. And so this is one way in which it's like completely not accessible. And it's also not accessible for neurodiverse users and like not accessible in general because you don't tell exactly what's going to happen when you click something. You just say click here. And this is why it's better to say like what exactly it's going to happen when you click on this particular button. So if it's for uploading images, you just say upload images. Or if it's for like downloading an ebook, you just say download the ebook. You just say clearly what's going to happen next.
So as a developer / designer, ask yourself what's going to happen to this button if it's completely detached from where you put it on the page.
Exactly. Just kind of like, like make a little like sneak peek of what's going to happen next.
Got it. And speaking of buttons, what's the importance of like iconography when it comes to associating with those buttons and I guess the interface in general?
Yeah, that's another very important point. Like when you need to like convey some information, it's better if you convey in like at least two different ways. Like for example, when you have a button and that goes to cart in an e-commerce website, you can use the icon of a cart and like just write cart on the button. So you use like two different means to convey the information. You use the icon and you use the text, and it's much easier for the user to understand what is this button supposed to do. And same goes also for like names of categories in the navigation.
Yeah. And is that because it provides more context or because it's giving like a backup route to understand what's going on there or both?
I would say both. And it's also like, it gives you like two clues. Like you have like two things that confirm that this is doing what this is doing. So it's much, you have like two things to make sure that you're in the right place.
Got it. Okay, so talking about kind of the page in general, how can colors impact a neurodiverse user?
Yeah, so this is the part when you can kind of fall into a trap of getting like you want to get the contrast right. You want really good contrast, but you can also like go over the top and go and choose some very bright neon colors. And these colors, like even despite our good intentions, they can lead to sensory overstimulation, like especially in autistic users. And it also like it's really different depending on different, like, like on personal preferences of these users. Like some of my friends who are on the autism spectrum, they really have like different preferences, but overall it's better to stick to like softer, milder colors. But still like pay attention to the contrast. So the contrast needs to be sufficient for the text to remain easy to read, but also not too bright, not to avoid overstimulation.
Got it. Okay. And are there specific colors that kind of fall into into a bad camp or a good camp, or is it really just that, contrast versus brightness versus loudness, I guess I would say?
Yeah, the saturation kind of. Yeah. So I would avoid like very, very, like very high saturation. And when it comes to research, like when some groups were researching these different ranges of colors with children on the spectrum, and they found out that blue and green hues were kind of preferred, but it's not like it's going to work in every, for every person. It's just like a tendency that's there, but it can be very different when it comes to personal preferences. Anyway, I think it's just best to stick to soft and milder colors to make it, not too loud.
Got it. And what happens when we start moving these colors around? What should we consider when something's being animated?
Well, when it comes to animations, there's also another very important point. Well, the first thing is we shouldn't just jump out with animations or with autoplay or with simulation just out of the blue. If people don't expect it. Like when it comes to people with attention deficit, it might distract them. It might just kind of, make them forget what they were supposed to do and kind of keep them completely off the track. And when it comes to people with the autism spectrum, this may just trigger anxiety, and this may just become even traumatic for some. So any animation that's that's not kind of announced before, it's just jumping at you, might be really, really harmful. So this is something that we should really be careful with. Like even if we are not on neurodiverse, you might end up surprised. So imagine just this, but more intensified. It's like you having a tab with music playing out of nowhere and you have no idea where it comes from. So it's that, but more intense.
So don't do the user design version of a jump scare.
Exactly. You could call it a jump scare completely.
Nice. Okay, so in kind of in that same vein, you have a couple of recommendations for video, and I agree with this just across the board, but autoplay is bad, closed captions are good. But why is that true for a neurodiverse audience?
I think it's the same idea, kind of, as with putting both icons and descriptions on buttons. Like you have two different ways to convey meaning. At times it might be easier to focus on the subtitles. At times it might be easier to focus on the sound, on the images. And it's just easier for them to understand the point of the video if you have different ways of conveying the same information.
Got it. And I personally find I guess we kind of also have, there's almost a repeat there, right? Like autoplay could turn itself into a jump scare, right?
Yeah, and sometimes it's just purely frustrating. And if you add the anxiety part to it and all the other unpleasant things, it can become just a nightmare. So yeah. Because
when I'm reading something and then all of a sudden the ad plays like at the top of the page, that's easily one of my top 10 pet peeves. Like it drives me crazy. And if anything, I just stop reading and close the tab and go away.
Yeah, and it's just, you're saying this from a perspective of, just let's say a non-neurodiverse user, I believe, and just imagine this, but more intensified and triggering all your anxieties and the things that are your pet peeves, basically. So that's even worse.
And does the closed captioning go back to what you were saying before about giving more context and more paths for people to understand what's going on?
Exactly. So if one path doesn't quite work, you can still rely on the other one.
Got it. Nice. Okay, so this is brilliant stuff. Are there tools out there that people can use to test this, to see how good their pages are doing, to kind of put themselves on some guardrails for this?
Yeah, so one of I would say is if you're looking for a single source of truth when it comes to cognitive accessibility and accessibility in general, is of course the WCAG page, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. They've recently released, I've even added the link so we can attach it to the podcast. They've recently released this very big document with user stories of people who are neurodiverse. So you can look at specific examples of how people use the web, and you can, and they also added some recommendations for these cases. So I think if you're looking for a really good set of guidelines, WCAG is the way to go. And when it comes to other tools, they are contrast checkers. You can use to make sure that your website meets this contrast requirements. And one of them is WebAIM. So you can check if it meets the WCAG standards. And if you're using a design tool, there is a plugin that's called Stark, and it has all these accessibility compliance tools.
Nice.
Yeah, another thing when it comes to writing, the part I'm doing professionally, there are plenty of plain language tools you can use to make sure that your website copy, your text is easy to understand. And I think one of the best ones that are free and accessible to everyone is Hemingway. It's called Hemingway app. And it's a web app. There is a free version that's pretty good. It has all you need to check whether your website is written in plain language. And it uses the fog standard, the fog scale, to see whether your text is easy to understand. So I'd really recommend that one too.
Nice. Awesome stuff. Is there any books that you recommend just to kind of read about this kind of stuff?
When it comes to books, this topic is still pretty new. So it's still kind of, the community around this building. But there are some names I would really recommend when it comes to the topic of neurodiversity. And one of these names is Rachel Morgan Trimmer. She's a neurodiversity consultant, and she posts a lot of content about her research, her experience online. And there is also Tim Goldstein, I've mentioned, and he's a neurodiverse communication specialist and then a neurodiversity advocate. And there's a TED Talk, an interview about his experience with being a neurodiverse professional in the IT industry, which is also quite surprising at times and very interesting and eye-opening when it comes to the experience of a neurodiverse person in the tech world. So I would also recommend that one. And there are several institutions that work with people on the autism spectrum, such as Living Autism, which is based in the UK, and they have a lot of like written recommendations based on their research. So that's also pretty cool and nice to check out.
And that's our show. Now, we will put into the show notes links to Kalina's writings. She's got a great blog post, which goes into even more detail from the stuff we were talking about today. And I will try to include links to as many of those tools that she just described as we can. Now, before we go, I did ask after Kalina's favorite non-technical hobby. And I don't know if it's a favorite of mine, but it is something that I use every day.
I would say coffee. I'm a huge specialty coffee geek.
Nice.
And so this was like the first thing that came to my mind.
That's awesome. Yeah. What's if I'm in Poland, what's your recommendation?
Well, I am based in Kraków, Poland, and Kraków, like, not to brag, but Kraków has a pretty cool specialty coffee scene. So I would say just check out Kraków for specialty coffee. So but I was in Chicago, and I really enjoyed the coffee there too. I was in Stumptown, I think it was, in several locations, and that was really nice too.
Okay. I am very glad that we could hold up to your standards. If you're ever in Australia, one thing I learned very quickly in Australia was that almost all Australians take their coffee really seriously.
They do. I have a Polish Australian neighbor, and they do take their coffee very seriously. I can confirm that.
I ordered a simple Americano black while I was just randomly talking to one of my Australian cohorts, and he looked at me like I was dead to him.
I think if anyone's serious, if any nation is serious about their coffee, I think it's Australians.
Well, wherever you live, try to find some specialty coffee if that's the thing that helps you start your day. I want to thank Kalina for the great conversation and information. And as always, I want to thank you for listening. Now, if you want to learn more about this show, head on over to developer.salesforce.com/podcast, where you can hear old episodes, see the show notes, and have links to your favorite podcast service. Thanks again, everybody. I'll talk to you next week.